Okay, this is chapter 33b from this book here, The Medical Reformation, and we're talking about sympathetic autonomic nervous system and Pan's parasympathetic autonomic, which is the autonomic nervous system, the accelerator and the brake of your moods and your life. So sympathetic again is fight or flight, stress. Parasympathetic is rest, relax, rest and digest, feed and breed. Okay, so long-term potentiation is the mechanism of long-term memory. When you have excessive psychological stress, that will impair your long-term memory. Don't get me wrong, an acute stressful event, you might have like a light bulb photographic memory of that one event that stresses you out. But when you're psychologically stressed, you're preoccupied with worrying about something, whatever it might be. You'll have a hard time learning on other subjects. Okay, so you want to be relaxed, calm down, focused. You need to optimize your sleep because the brain cleans itself at night. That's the glymphatic system. We talked about that in other lectures. Combination of glial support cells of the brain with lymphatic. You got lymphatics in the outer meninges of the brain, not in the brain parenchyma itself, the deep tissue, but in the outer covering layers. There are lymphatics in the skull. The brain grows new neurons during sleep, neurogenesis. It consolidates memories during sleep. So you need sleep to become smarter. One of the world champions of memory was asked one time, does he recommend any supplements for improving performance in memory contests? And he said he recommends vitamin S for sleep. He says that's the number one thing that'll make your performance better. Okay, I can also tell you, in my academic career, I never once did an all-nighter. I never had to. I always studied a lot every day, so I was ready for the test. And I had walk and talks where I'd talk to myself. The reason I'd say that is then I'd get a good night's sleep, I'd wake up and I'd perform pretty well versus I'd see a lot of mediocre students are pulling all-nighters and stuff the last weeks before finals and they're exhausted, they're stressed out, pulling themselves down into a sleep deprivation brain, the mammal brain, so to speak, rather than the supratentorial cerebral cortex brain that's more thoughtful, more nuanced, makes them smarter. For complex learning, you're always smarter when you first wake up in the morning. And I can tell you, this is one of the rules of being a good academic scholar. As soon as you wake up, get into your desk and start studying. The first thing you do. No workouts, no showers, nothing. No meal. Sit down and study. And you'll get on a roll. Okay, minimize distraction. Means no internet, no cell phone in the room, no radio or TV, no pesky family members. Have a study room dedicated to that. Ideal function is what is called peak flow. When you have enough stress or motivation to energize you, but not so much that you're distracted. Because you're more intelligent when you're in sort of a clever, fun, playful mood. That's why we can be more funny around our friends because we're relaxed. We're enjoying each other. We feel free to speak. Quiet makes our ears happy. You can't turn off the noise in your house. So I have ear protectors. So like if my family's making a lot of noise, I'll just put my ear protectors on and I don't have to hear them. Because you can't turn your ears off other than putting ear protectors on. So good light makes our eyes happy, makes it easier to read. No smell makes our nose happy. So optimize your study conditions, having a comfortable chair. Can have a standing desk to get more exercise, but you don't know if you're going to think as well on a standing desk. Simplify your life. Do all the low IQ stuff late in the afternoon or evening so it's out of the way. All right. What promotes neurogenesis, meaning the formation of new neurons? Intelligent conversation, reading, exercise, being in a parasympathetic mood so your brain has time to sort of build itself up. When you're stressed out, you're not going to be building new neurons. You're not thinking about the distant future building. You're thinking about surviving the next 20 minutes when you're in a intensely SANS mood. Get adequate, have a good diet. We talked about that, the benefits of a healthy diet. There's also food and mood. A healthy diet puts you in a better mood because your brain's protected from all the excitotoxins in a junk food, processed food diet. Getting your sleep. Neurogenesis occurs in the hippocampus, the periventricular regions, and the substantia nigra. That's important, the substantia nigra. That might be part of why exercise can be helpful to, let's say, a Parkinson's patient where they have problems with a lack of dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra. Substantia just means stuff or substance. Nigra means black, so the black stuff, which means the midbrain, where so many dopamine brain cells are, neurons are. Okay, it takes about 2 months for a new neuron to sprout and establish stable connections. Synaptogenesis can happen a lot faster. You can modify, strengthen, or weaken a synapses a lot faster because we can learn things a lot faster than that. I like to walk around the house when I'm reading. I know that I've got better attention when I'm walking. And that's another way for learning for neurogenesis, because I'm walking and reading. I seem to remember better that way, but it's often inconvenient to do that. Of course, you can write in your book more readily when you're seated down. In mice, the more the neurogenesis, the better their cognitive function. Okay, does the brain hunger for knowledge? I think it does. There was a really good video. Here's the reference for it. This is on YouTube. You might want to go to this. I'll put a link to this down in the description below. Frank Longo is a neurology professor at Stanford, and he gave this long lecture on learning and memory. It's like 2.5 hours, but at 1 hour and 50 minutes, he shows a special green stain that can show neurons moving, and it's like the neurons have all these dendrites, and they're trying to receive messages. They're trying to talk to each other, and it really conveys the idea of the brain hungering for knowledge. And that's how I feel. Like I can't get into my car unless I have an audio CD to listen to. For me, it's just painful to listen to the radio. The radio is always like dishonest, gaslighting crap in terms of the news channels. And then the music usually stinks. I like the religious channels. Usually they don't have the greatest reception, but at least they'll play some nice songs. In my opinion, anybody who plays beat music is turning themselves into an idiot, because you can't think, and if you're not thinking, then you're not using your brain. You're becoming stupider. So, it's a time to think. What should be our goal? To spend as much of our life in PANS or PANS balanced with a little bit of SANS, and to avoid excessive SANS. Why so much emphasis on avoiding SANS? Well, because it's like a neurotoxin. You'll increase glutamate in your brain. So unnecessary excessive stress will make you kind of stupid. Most people have a little bit too much of excess SANS in their life. Notice when you have your day off, you'll defecate more often, and that's because you're in more of a PANS mood. Your digestive system's working more effectively. Why does excessive stress make us stupid? Because it'll increase glutamate transmission across the hippocampus unnecessarily without associated useful information or reason. And then that'll often be accentuated by the MFG in the food, by the aspartame and all these other things, EMFs, cell phones, etc. Avoid TV. TV is like low IQ pro feed, bread and circuses for the dummies. There's only going to be generic programming because they got to sell advertising, so it's going to be geared toward the ignorant masses. There's always better choices on a computer. I've never in my adult life owned a TV. Anyone with an IQ of 120 and up will find TV insipid, vulgar, disgusting. It's an insult. If you like TV, that means you have increased risk for Alzheimer's. You're not using your brain. People who are sedentary, non-readers, functional illiterates, and TV watchers have higher risk of dementia. I don't really like the word Alzheimer's. I sometimes put it in for convenience, but I should say dementia. I should have wrote just dementia there. You shouldn't even have a TV in your house. It promotes laziness and stupidity. The more high schoolers watch TV, the worse their grades. Also, the worse their behavior typically. And it also is a sign of them being conformist. The more people watch TV, the less they read, and basically the stupider they are. Okay. What's the vicious cycle of excessive stress and stupidity? Well, you're excessively stressed out. You don't sleep well because you don't sleep well the next day. You'll probably drink more coffee and be more stressed. So compensating for it by drinking caffeine is pretty stupid, other than if you have to drive to keep you awake. People also have a tendency when they have insomnia to crave sweets and processed foods, so they'll eat more of that junk food, and again, it all contributes to having a negative effect on their cognitive function. Glutamate's an excitatory neurotransmitter. It's about 90% of brain neurotransmitter, causes increased activity in the postsynaptic neuron that receives the neurotransmitter. Under normal, and that'll increase cytoplasmic calcium and go down that whole path of increased cytoplasmic calcium. Under normal conditions in the human body, all amino acids are L-amino acids. The L refers to the chirality of the amino acid. Glutamate's side chain is propanoic acid. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter, and that's kind of getting the chirality into there's different types of MSG or MFG glutamate. Can it be D or L? So L is the one that's typically active in humans, but there's often both, racemic mixtures when you have synthetic forms of it. Glutamate is, if you just have MSG, then you're getting the L anyways. Glutamate is by far the most common neurotransmitter of the brain. At the time I wrote this, I wrote 80%, but different books will say 90%. I just find 90% a convenient number to work with, and then say 5% for GABA, and then 1% for all the other common ones approximately. It's released by the presynaptic neuron. Postsynaptic neuron has receptors for the glutamate. The most important receptor is the NMDA receptor. Actually, the AMPA receptor first is a sodium channel, depolarizes the cell. Once the cell is depolarized, meaning that it has a less negative charge, that means the magnesium in the center of the NMDA receptor will be less attracted to the previously negative charge inside the cytoplasm of the postsynaptic cell. So the magnesium will pop out of NMDA. When NMDA opens up that receptor for glutamate, it'll let calcium into the cell, and you'll increase cytoplasm calcium of the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, just a little basic neurophysiology. The resting membrane potential of a neuron is in the ballpark of negative 65 millivolts. Some will say negative 70 millivolts. And like I said, the magnesium is bound in the center of NMDA because it's attracted to that negative charge. But once the cell depolarizes because of the sodium coming in through the AMPA receptor for glutamate, then that magnesium will pop out and you'll start letting calcium into the cell. Aspartate is also an activator of glutamate receptors, and that I call it baby glutamate. That'll let more calcium into the cell. What's the difference between normal neuron function and excitotoxicity? Well, mild to moderate amounts of glutamate that are part of our daily activities and learning, that's good. It's just when they're high from excessive stress or excessive caffeine, sleep deprivation, EMF, or other sources, then they become harmful. When you overstimulate the hippocampus, it can burn out and die or go into apoptosis. Who's the person who really figured out excitotoxicity? The first great scientist on excitotoxicity was Dr. Olney. He figured out in the 1960s that excessive glutamate causes neuronal cell death. And that was a really big deal for him to figure that out because it was putting all the baby formulas, causing brain damage to all these babies. Excessive calcium entry into the neuron cytoplasm is the key to cell death by excitotoxicity, which leads to apoptosis, programmed cell death of a neuron. What increases cytoplasm calcium? Well, the monosodium glutamate, MSG, it's really the glutamate. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. The glutamate. It can be from MSG. It can be from MFG. Will cause increased excitation by releasing glutamate and activating the postsynaptic neuron. Aspartate from aspartame can have a similar effect. Okay, glyphosate, the glycine, can have a similar effect and activate the NMDA receptor. These amino acids that function as neurotransmitters that are excitatory are called excitatory amino acids. And then the transporter into the astrocytes to take them up out of the synaptic cleft are called excitatory amino acid transporters. And Dr. Blaylock did a real nice job of covering the subject of MSG and aspartame as potential excitotoxins in his book, The Taste That Kills by Russell Blaylock. Okay, what else about electrolytes and excitotoxicity? Anything that increases intracellular cytoplasm calcium is going to potentially increase excitotoxicity. Elevated blood calcium, deficiency in potassium, because then you'll have problems running your sodium-potassium pumps and you'll dissipate your sodium electrochemical gradient. So our ancestors probably ate about 25 to 1 more potassium than sodium, but now in the modern world, people eat like 10 or 15 times more sodium than potassium, and they can dissipate their plasma membrane neuron electrochemical gradients, and that'll decrease the function of the neuron. They can also be deficient in magnesium, again, because magnesium and potassium come from plants. The good stuff comes from plants, and if you're deficient in that, you're not going to run those plasma membrane pumps so well, and you'll have a less effective membrane charge gradient. And the other thing, too, about it is you need dietary fiber. Dietary fiber not only maintains the gut barrier, it also is used to maintain the blood-brain barrier so you can have precise, intact neuronal ionic gradients across the plasma membrane. You need those to have effective neuron function. So what I'm saying is lack of blood-brain barrier causing leaky gut, also causing leaky blood-brain barrier can cause, brain fog, okay? The books will often just say intracellular calcium when they really mean cytoplasm calcium. I specifically say it because you can also store calcium in the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria, and they're all intracellular, so that's why I specifically say cytoplasm. I think that's easier. Skeletal muscles will store calcium in their sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the S will be on there. Instead of just calling it endoplasmic reticulum, they'll call it sarcoplasm, and that's why it's called sarcoplasmic endoplasmic reticulum. Calcium ATPase is the pump on there. Other ways to lower calcium in the cell, you can pump it into the extracellular matrix, like with the NACA exchanger or the PMCA, plasma membrane calcium ATPase. You can also pump it into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is also called the endoplasmic reticulum in a neuron, and that's the circle pump. And you really need that. That's an important thing. How do neurons lower their cytoplasmic calcium level? Well, the knockout exchanger is super fast. It can pump thousands of calcium ions out of the cell in a second. The plasma membrane calcium ATPase is much slower, but it's in all cells. This is more of something for excitable cells, your neurons, some of your muscle cells. Plasma membrane calcium ATPase is more important in non-excitable cells. The excitable cells are neurons, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Circa pumps calcium from cytoplasm to the endoplasmic reticulum, and it's important in neurons. Almost most things that smell bad tend to be circa pump inhibitors. Plus, the higher your hemoglobin A1C, the more circa inhibition you have, which is going to decrease your cognitive function. So those persons walking around with high hemoglobin A1Cs are at increased risk to be stupid. Okay, here's a list of some things that cause excitotoxicities. First of all is your dietary fat, especially sat fat, because that'll inhibit complex 3 of electron transport. And it leads to hypoxia because not as much oxygen is delivered to the cells because you decrease the ability of the cells to deliver oxygen when all the red blood cells are stuck together by fat. Okay. Excessive psychological stress increases cortisol, increases synaptic transmission of glutamate. Stress equivalents are like caffeine, sleep deprivation. Corticosteroid medications. Cushing syndrome is super rare. I see Cushing syndrome about once every 10 years. It's really rare, so I kind of forget about that. Tobacco is a stimulant. Can have an excitotoxin contributory effect. Sleep apnea can cause nighttime hypoxia. They put a pulse ox on people during sleep studies, and I've seen people in the 60s with that. We talked about MSG, MFG, aspartame, aspartate. Okay, excitotoxicity in the ischemic brain. These are some papers that I read on the subject related to this. Oh, and these are papers about how you get tissue hypoxia when you have a high-fat meal. Okay, and that's by Peter Quo. He was doing this back in the 1950s. He's a cardiologist out of Pennsylvania. Here's another paper. So those are good papers. Diabetes causes nighttime hypoglycemia. Excessive dietary calcium. Calcium is prothrombotic. It can actually cause some clotting when you have a big bolus boost of it from a supplement. I think supplements of calcium are a bad idea. Like 2.57 times increased all-cause mortality. Excessive vitamin D supplements can lead to increased calcium absorption. I don't recommend doing that. McDougall has a good lecture on that. He doesn't prescribe vitamin D to anybody unless they are almost like institutionalized and can't go out in the sun. Excessive dietary sodium, that will also lead to loss of potassium and magnesium and contribute to increased insulin resistance, which will lead to increased insulin in the blood, and that increased insulin in the blood leads to increased activation of the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. So it's not good. It'll have an increase to your stress effect. Lack of potassium and magnesium, kind of like the opposite of this. You get potassium and magnesium from eating plants. You get high sodium from eating processed food, and people often put it on meat as well. Excessive dietary iron can cause oxidative stress. Deficiency of vitamin C. Deficiency of vitamin B12. Here's some papers to that effect. Diuretics can cause a loss of potassium and magnesium in the urine, so one has to be careful with those. These are things that cause brain hypoperfusion. Is going to lead to lack of oxygen delivery to the mitochondria, meaning less ATP production. Plus all those mitochondrial inhibitors, I talked about them, like fungal inhibitors. A lot of food dyes, red number 3, will lower circuit function in the brain. Food preservatives, BHT, BHA, TBHQ, they're all circuit inhibitors. That's another reason why you don't want to eat processed food. You're going to decrease your mitochondrial function, which means decrease your brain function, which means increase your vulnerability to excitotoxicity. They're all bad. These estrogenic chemicals are bad because so many of them are also neurotoxic. Atrazine's a mitochondrial inhibitor. So is bisphenol A. Bad, bad, bad. And many of them, about 80% of them, are neurotoxic. Some people have even said, some of the scientists, I think it was Seralini, that it shouldn't even be just called estrogenic chemicals. They should be called estrogen and neuro-disrupting chemicals. Sunscreens have a bunch of circa inhibitors and estrogenic chemicals. That's why I never use sunscreens. I think they're stupid. Non-stick coatings on cookware, like for, non-stick cookware, they'll have a lot of fluoride in there. Fluoride's a neurotoxin. You don't want to ingest that. It's better to cook on stainless steel. Better to never fry food. I only cook with an Instapot, and I just boil water. I cook all my starches by boiling, so I don't need to do anything else. Aluminum inhibits circa. So aluminum's a neurotoxin in a bunch of ways. It can also have an inhibitory effect on mitochondrial function. That's why I'll never eat food off aluminum foil. It's stupid to wear deodorant and you're putting aluminum on yourself. Let's see. I think that was glyphosate also is neurotoxic. Yep. Okay. Well, it's neurotoxic because it's an excitotoxin. Lead is also a mitochondrial inhibitor. It can be transdermally absorbed. Some heavy metals can be absorbed, transdermally. Mercury inhibits SERCA in the brain. You get high mercury in fish. You get high mercury in high fructose corn syrup. You get some leaking from fluorescent light bulbs potentially. That's why I don't like to use those. Cadmium inhibits SERCA in the brain. Cadmium comes off brake pads on automobiles. That's why I won't sit in a sidewalk cafe near a busy street. I think that's stupid. There's sometimes cadmium in cheap jewelry, and children wear it, and it is transdermally absorbed. The higher the hemoglobin A1C, like I said, the more SERCA inhibition you got. Glyphosate's as an excitotoxin. It also increases leaky gut, which can increase blood-brain barrier permeability. It's a bad idea. MJ decreases SERCA function. Alcohol lowers SERCA function. So all these things are making you stupider. And that's what I meant by death by 1,000 cuts. They all add up to impair cognitive function. Fluoride, I think, is put in the water to pacify the population, make them docile and stupid, good future slaves. Inhalation of chlorine can have a lowering effect on cardiac SERCA, so that might not be so good for your energy level. In general, the halogens like fluorine, chlorine, bromine are all detrimental to SERCA. So that's why it's nice to have a whole house carbon filter so you don't inhale that stuff when you take a shower. And that's carbon filter removes chlorine. Cleaning chemicals are all toxic, like TCE. That's why I no longer take any of my clothes to a cleaning place. I'd rather have a wrinkle in my shirt than that. Paints, adhesive, and glues, PCBs are all tend to be SERCA inhibitors. Benzopyrene from cigarette smoke, from grilling meat. Actually, the smoke from grilling meat will lower SERCA. Titanium dioxide nanoparticles lower SERCA. Those things can be used in sunscreens, whiteners, and cosmetics, medications, and processed foods. Another reason I avoid those things. I don't take any medications. Things that decrease excitotoxicity. Well, you eat your plant foods. You get your magnesium, you get your potassium, you get your dietary fiber to maintain your blood-brain barrier. Your other good things come from your plant foods. Get your sunshine from the sun. So anyways, that ends Chapter 33. We talked a little bit about the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system and their effect on excitotoxicity in the brain. So I hope that was helpful.